Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Lessons from Lockdown. This morning, we're going to be hearing from Gavin Brown, who is a professor of education at the University of Auckland in New Zealand, we've just been discussing, they're in lockdown also. So he'll be talking to us this morning about how tech maybe isn't the answer and providing his sort of opinions as an assessor and assessment specialist. Gavin?
Thank you very much, everyone. Kia ora tātou. Some time ago, during our first lockdown, we got asked here at the University of Auckland what we actually thought was going to come next after the lockdown. And so I spent some time thinking about that, and I was interviewed by a journalist who reported what I said in the newspaper, and then that made me think, well, I need to write this up. And so this response is an evolving response as I've thought about what it means for schooling beyond the lockdown, when we can potentially return to classrooms, and whether we should be returning to classrooms. And now that we've got all this fancy technology, what should we be doing? So I want to talk about the tensions that I see in this. And my perspective begins with this very wonderful quote from William Gibson, who is an author of speculative fiction, or more commonly science fiction. Sometime in the 1990s, in an interview, he said, the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. And I think that's really important for us to understand, that the things that we might be doing in first world countries and are not always the same. And they aren't the same between first world countries, and they aren't the same for people even within the first world countries. And so people are in different situations, and their experience of the future is going to be different to people who are richer, better educated, and living in a more technological world. To illustrate that, let's consider that in terms of industry, different countries are in different stages of industrial development. And a country like my own in New Zealand, we don't really have any Industry 1 or Industry 2. We have Industry 3 and 4, but we have a pre-industry called agriculture and scenery and tourism that isn't even on this scale of distributions of industries. So the world is not the same, and their responses to pandemic and schooling are clearly not the same. In the same way, schools' response to various kinds of technological innovations is not always the same. And schools are much more conservative than a lot of people think. Pierre Bourdieu is really right that schools are teaching the past and bringing the past into the future. And so there is always pain when the world changes and schooling doesn't. And my question really, is it inevitable that schooling will undergo some sort of transformative change, and especially a transformative change with technology? Some 20 years ago, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, began work on possible schooling futures. And they were looking ahead 20 years to the year 2020. So we're in this place of possible schooling futures. And they identified 6 different options, which I want to quickly review for you. And under 3 major ideas: we'll carry on with the way we are going now. The world will be re-schooled. We'll transform schools into something else, or we'll get rid of schools. And each one has its merits and attractions. Under the status quo, the 2 scenarios they imagined was one where public schools and bureaucracies of government would carry on bringing about this fundamental social function of educating citizens so that they're prepared for the future and prepared for work and prepared for further education. Scenario two, which clearly is happening in some parts of the world much more than here in New Zealand, is a much more market-driven approach where market entrepreneurs in education buy and sell products and people choose them freely. And some of these will be positive effects and some will be negative effects. And clearly, from my perspective, the United States of America is a country where the market approach to schooling is much more evident than in my country. Reschooling says, well, actually, schools are a good idea, not just because we need educated citizens, but because they do things much more powerfully than create learners. What they do is they create societies where communities of people interact with each other, where we can deliver resources and services through this central attraction point, magnet of people come to the school. The alternative scenario was where we abandoned this socialization role of school and just focus on schools being centers of learning, where we have fewer teachers, we have more technology, more focus, and only those who want to learn come. And then the tragedy of, from my point of view as an educator and previous school teacher, would be one in which we dismantle school institutions, where we say, look, we don't need schools. Everything can be done by the internet. All we have to do is give people Wi-Fi, computers, microphones, screens, and speakers, and the world can be done, the whole of schooling can be done by computers. And the scariest one is where whole of society breaks down, children are not cooperative or obedient, schools begin to fall apart in terms of infrastructure, and so teachers leave schooling and go find better jobs with better pay and less emotional stress. You can imagine that that's probably the darkest of those 6 futures that OECD imagined were possible. And the OECD did some work on where are we now. And in this diagram, you can see the 6 different options, and their analysis at the time positioned most country systems in the close to the bureaucracy system, the status quo. But a few schools, places like the white circle are heading towards some sort of scenario 2 of learning organizations or social centers. So it really depends on where in the world you are, what kind of schooling system you have. There are pressures on schools and societies that already we can identify. And this diagram shows many different kinds of pressures that are pushing and pulling on the current school systems. And I want to add now, COVID-19, the pandemic, is putting new pressures, especially on the market model, on learning networks, and schools as core social centers. Where are we in this matter now? And every country has a different response to the COVID-19. In the United States, there isn't one clear, coherent response, unlike here in New Zealand, where we have a much smaller society, a much greater central control. We're having one response. We're making use of technologies, and we're only gradually opening schools. And scenario 5 is the one that is the most obvious one, where the responses are using technology, portable and personal technologies, Wi-Fi. We're even using televisions and computers and mobile phones. Plus, we're using lots of digital teaching technologies of not just like I'm doing now, a talking head, but actually where we're having online chats and audio and video lectures with content-rich websites. These are the things that we're doing in response to the COVID-19 solution when everyone's locked down. And here in New Zealand, we've got websites full of resources where government agencies are taking the lead, creating TV channels, and where special emphasis from our Ministry of Māori Development, where non-government agencies are providing resources to schools, homeschooled parents, and the kids at home. Even private companies are supplying resources and activities to help keep kids learning. And there are worldwide links that our New Zealand government is making available on the Learning from Home website. So we're jumping into this because we want kids to be kept active in learning. So what does all of this do for us? Certainly, there are some benefits. The bridges, but these kinds of technologies help bridge the gap between school and the real world, creating some more authenticity by allowing students to be engaged with real companies and real things. It forces students to be more independent as learners, which is always a good thing when students and children make an effort. It certainly allows for individualized and potentially speedy learning, which is always one of the arguments of the homeschool movement, that it allows kids to find things faster without waiting for the rest of the class. And certainly, it's a mechanism by which the private sector can shine their badges and say, we're doing something for everyone. Here's a resource that we're giving to you for free. These are good things. However, there are some costs and challenges for us as a society as we weigh up this solution. Hardware, software, and connectivity costs are on the individual families, and it is absolutely clear that not every family, even in our society, has the resources to do this. It also requires opportunities for the child at home to be alone with the technology. And not every family is in a situation where a child learning at home has full command and control of access to a machine and the internet, when mom and dad might need it as well, and when there's more than one more than one student at that home school needing access to these materials. So the actual infrastructure cost is on the family, and that's unfairly distributed. My family can afford it, but not every family can. I can afford this resource as an academic because I don't have to also homeschool children. So it's unfair burden on workers who have children at home. So this solution is an unfair solution. And if we said, well, let's ask the government to give every kid and every family and every worker access to this resource of hardware, software, and connectivity, a lot of people would find that was politically unacceptable. There is research that I've read here in New Zealand that says sometimes private sector resources that schools make use of aren't actually good curriculum. And fundamentally, are we heading towards a future where we transfer the public investment in schools and schooling resources to a private profit sector, which is the thing that colleagues of mine like Bob Lingard especially are predicting is not necessarily a good thing. And there's a part of me that is fundamentally a humanist. Many years ago, Isaac Asimov, who again, a speculative fiction writer, wrote this short story in which he imagined a world where children learn individually with machine tutors who test their learning and adapt work to fit the student's learning. And part of the story has these lines that really speak to me. Margie was thinking about the old schools they had when her grandfather's grandfather was a little boy. All the kids from the whole neighborhood came, laughing and shouting in the schoolyard, sitting together in the schoolroom, going home together at the end of the day. They learned the same things so that they could help one another on the homework and talk about it. And the teachers were people. The mechanical teacher was flashing on the screen. When we add the fractions 1/2 and 1/4, Margie was thinking about how the kids must have loved it in the old days. She was thinking about the fun they had. And Asimov is pointing here to something that schools do that I'm not sure we want to give up, because it's about us as humans interacting and working together. So I look at these 6 scenarios, and I looked at scenario 3 as a better future, a future that we have to work towards beyond the COVID pandemic lockdown. And to me, the Maori proverb, he aha, te mea nui o te ao, he tangata, he tangata, he tangata, really speaks to me. This asks the question, what is the most important thing in the world? And the answer 3 times is, it is people. And when you reinforce that 3 times in any discourse, you're saying this is super important. So we need to find a way, I believe, as human beings, to keep ourselves as humans at the center of schooling. That schooling exists to bring up children, not just to be educated and to be literate and numerate, but to be human. So to me, out of these 6 scenarios, the scenario where we revise schools to be core social centers, so there is an integration of learning, employment, welfare, health services, and the things that tend to get forgotten in testing: art, creativity, being kind, being a real human and a full human. That's the kind of things that I want for my grandchildren, as well as your children and grandchildren. There are examples of this already happening. Social learning resource that we can see evident in, at least in my country, is the community library. Community libraries are popular places. Why? Because they're warm, they're quiet, they have desks, they have free internet, they have electricity, and they're a place where you can go and meet and greet your friends and neighbors. And incidentally, they're a place to pick up a good read. So I imagine, what would if schools were more like this? And to some extent, this is partially existing, at least here in New Zealand, where schools are more than learning hubs, where there is a policy that schools are there to meet the well-being needs of children and young people. And so services are integrated into them. Some schools are providing breakfast and lunch because nutritional well-being is so important that a hungry belly is not a learning mind. There are health and counseling services in schools because kids go through life dramas, sometimes not even of their own making, because families and society around them make life hard, where we provide life skills education. The urban service, Maori Te Whanau au Waiparera in West Auckland, is a service that is trying to integrate these core services for Maori families who are more socially disadvantaged than the average. So we have examples of this unevenly distributed schooling scenario 3 that already exist. And if it already exists, that means we could copy it, we could expand on it. It's not impossible. Governments have invested in schools in our country in different communities. Schools are spread around the country, and they're there as services. And often they're not used extensively and deeply on the weekends and after 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And they have expensive physical plant. That means they have large meeting spaces and small meeting spaces. They have technologies, including internet. They have artistic and creative spaces and materials because schools provide art education and sports education and practical materials education like technology and facilities for cooking and making things with hard materials and soft materials in sport. So these resources have already been paid for by us. They already exist, and they're to some extent not fully utilized. So my idea of a schooling future beyond the lockdown is that we try to make greater use outside of school hours of the infrastructure schools have to open up for families and communities as a center for social good as well as a learning good. Learning to cook together. My son is a chef in Sweden, and as part of the Swedish for Immigrants system, he was involved in a program where they were bringing together adult learners from as refugees to learn Swedish by learning to cook the Swedish way and to learn to and the adults teaching cooking the refugee way to Swedish people. So it's a great mechanism for building learning and building community. There's medical facilities, and having a nurse there would be a great resource that would be a complement to medical clinics and opportunities to learn how to create art. One of the things that we've discovered in the pandemic lockdown, we want and need art, movies, music, entertainment. The artists won't make us a lot of money, perhaps, but they will make our lives more human. So, school campuses, instead of being silent at night with prowling security guards, could become hubs for human interaction, support, and development. And the old phrase, Tannstaffel reminds us there is no such thing as a free lunch. What I'm dreaming of is not going to be cheap. It will require thinking about this by everyone. Will require us voting for this. It'll require us paying for this. And it requires the well-to-do like myself to contribute more than our share for the benefit of all. And unfortunately, under current conservative politics, many people are seeing this as a bad thing. So it leaves me to say to you, what future do you want? And what future are you willing to pay for? And if you want to read more extensively about my ideas, there's a link there to my article. Thank you very much for your time. Tim, over to you.
Thank you, Gavin. I didn't know what to expect when I read the title for your presentation, but I have to admit that I really enjoyed that, and I want to move to whichever country it is that we're talking about right now.
Scandinavia, the Nordic countries are probably doing it best.
Will they take me?
Yes. Well, New Zealanders are allowed to go to Nordic countries now without a lockdown quarantine. I'm not sure about Melburnians.
I don't think that I'm going to be allowed anywhere for quite some time. But I really appreciate the conversation you had. There were lots of sorts of things that I was thinking about as we sort of meandered through the six scenarios. I really enjoyed the quote that you put up of Isaac Asimov's, and I've taken a photo of that and I'm going to share that because I think it's wonderful to think that there were people thinking about the foibles of kind of the future all that time ago. It's really quite sort of relevant. But I wonder, what do you think? So, you said that we're going to need people to vote for these things, but are you optimistic that we might begin to move the needle in the direction that you're dreaming of?
There are many forces working against this. Extreme conservative politics and the use of social media and straight out lying shows us in examples of first world countries that are clearly heading in an opposite direction to this. It's the will of the people. And if we don't talk about this, we certainly won't achieve it because the people who are looking for, if I could switch back in the screens to the learner networks and market model scenarios, those people have money, they have influence, and they find that their kids are succeeding in this world, partly because they have the wealth to uh, provide the resources for themselves and their families, and they they are probably winning the day in terms of hearts and minds, and it takes us to have a conversation to say what we want is a different future, and we're willing to pay for it and work for it. So
No,
optimism, no,
well,
but we have to
yeah.
try.
Oh, look, I agree with you. I agree with you. And you're right. The thing is, I think internationally, or perhaps less so in your country, we are seeing a bit of a swing back to nationalism and sort of maybe not ultra conservatism, but views that are sort of more capitalist in sort of nature, I suppose. But look, I wanted to take a moment to thank you so much for that presentation. It really was sort of eye-opening for me. I really enjoyed it, and I'm going to be coming back to watch it again in the future. So thank you so much, Gavin, for joining us, and I hope that you have a great day.
Thank you very much, Tim. Enjoy the rest of your conference.
I will. Thank you.